So officially, welcome to the Knowledge is Power series. This is the first presentation of a three-part series meant to help students feel a little bit more educated about employment rights, some of the federal protections. And so we welcome you. Thanks for coming. Introduce ourselves briefly. I am Cheryl Rotyliano. I work in the Career Services office at IC. So of course I meet with students to help them with any career development topics, resumes, cover letters, internships, all the things. And do of course presentations like this. I'll let Emily introduce herself.
Hi everybody, I'm Emily Rockett. I'm an assistant counsel in the Office of the General Counsel here at Ithaca College. I've been here since late January, and prior to coming to IC, I worked as a labor relations specialist at GST BOCES, handling employment matters for a number of school districts in the Southern Tier. Before that, I worked at Miller Mayer in Ithaca, where part of my job was to advise local employers on labor and employment issues. So this is something I've been at for about 7 years. And I'm happy to be here and see you guys. I don't get to interact with students as much as I would like in my job, so this is really cool for me.
Awesome, thanks. So just going a little bit over today's agenda, what we're hoping to do is give an overview of mostly federal, but also some state protections pertaining to, today is about applications for jobs and internships as well as interviewing, including anti-discrimination protections. So, so today we're focusing on applications and interviews. The future sessions are going to go further into the process, and I'll talk about those at the very end also. We're also going to talk about resources for the governing bodies, where if someone is to experience discrimination, where they can report such discrimination. So we'll certainly go over that content as well.
So over the 10,000-foot view of what we're talking about, in all aspects of employment, there are federal and state protections. There are laws and regulations at different levels that govern what employers can and can't do at various steps in this process. At the state level, they vary quite a bit, and I will give this disclaimer probably 100 times during this presentation, right? Depending on the jurisdiction where you're applying for jobs, you need to check what the laws are. The laws in California are often very different from the laws in, say, Pennsylvania. New York and California, employment lawyers like to say, are in a battle for who can be, more worker friendly. Other states, not so much the same way. So you really want to make sure when you're going in, what state are you applying for? What rights do they protect? And in New York, I'll tell you, it's changed every year the past few years. So really staying up to date. There are exceptions to every rule. So we're speaking largely in generalities. If there are some noteworthy exceptions, we'll bring them up. But for the most part, again, this is just an introduction to the principles that govern your protections as you're applying for and potentially receiving jobs. Yeah, I figured New York and California were going to be pretty heavily represented. So that's good. Massachusetts tends to be not too far different from New York. But yeah, good news is most of you guys are applying to states that do a fairly better job than others of protecting workers. And the scope of this presentation is not to give you guys individual legal advice, because we don't have enough time and also aren't allowed to do that. We just want to point you in the direction of where to find resources regarding what your rights are in the workplace, know the issues that can come up, and start thinking about how to address those should they come up in your interview process. Alrighty, so we're gonna first start talking about the application stage. And one of the biggest employment protections is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII of that act prohibits employers from discriminating on a number of different bases. We're going to start talking about what they can't do. So they can't do what's called adverse employment actions, which include failing or refusing to hire, discriminate in terms of compensation or other terms of employment, You can't limit, segregate, or classify applicants in any way that would adversely affect your status, right? So if you are a woman, you are in the same applicant pool as men that are applying for the same job, right? They're not evaluating the women and the men that apply for a job differently. And the criteria are this chart here. So the actual ones that are named in the statute are the top 6. Your age, your race, your color, your religion, your sex, and your national origin. Sex has been broadly defined to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and transgender status. And this is fairly recent, actually, and you guys may have followed this in the Supreme Court in June of this year, I'm sorry. They held that firing individuals because of your sexual orientation or transgender status violates Title VII's prohibition on discrimination because of sex. State law protections are also really, really important here because they will take these age, race, color, religion, sex, national origin words, and like the Supreme Court did with sex, either through legislation or court decisions, those terms will be defined more broadly than they may be intuitively to you right now. So for instance, last year, the New York State legislature defined race to include hair texture and protective styles such as braids, locks, and twists because they were trying to combat discrimination against Black individuals who wore their hair in braids, locks, and twists. What you don't see on here, notably, is criminal history. Federal law doesn't prohibit employers from asking about your criminal history, which includes your arrest and your conviction records. It is really important to note, though, that some state and local laws, New York and California spring to mind, have rules against discriminating against you based on a prior arrest or a prior conviction. So if that is something you're concerned about, just make sure you do some research and check the jurisdiction for which you're applying before you disclose something that you don't necessarily have to disclose. All my examples are going to be New York because I've practiced here and that's what I know. But just remember, different states, different rules. New York State bans inquiries about prior arrest records that are not currently pending or have been resolved in favor of the individual. So if there's a youthful offender adjudication, they can't ask about it. Or if there's a sealed conviction, can't be forced to disclose it. If there's a pending arrest, then you are not protected. So if you get arrested while you're working, it's a whole different story, or convicted while you're at that place of employment, again, whole different story. There are, of course, exceptions to that, such as if you are a police or peace officer, or if there's a direct relationship or a threat, unreasonable risk that is inherent in your employment by virtue of the fact that you may have been convicted previously, then they get to ask about it. But just something to think about as you apply for jobs going forward. Does anybody have any questions about the protected characteristics at this point? That comes under, I believe, sex, because I think the logic there is nobody asks a man if they're married, or if they ask a man if they're married, it hasn't historically had the same implications. It's the same deal with children. If you are asking a woman whether she has children and taking action based on her answer, that is something that you would not do to a male candidate. Which basically, so if you are doing that, that means that you are discriminating on the basis of sex, which is not something that you're allowed to do. Do in that situation is inquire why they're asking, which is going to, and Cheryl, if you have other practical advice, please jump in here. But if you put them on the spot and say, why is that information pertinent to my ability to do this job? They are then placed in the position where they have to think, oh shoot, I probably shouldn't have asked that question. And they will either backtrack or dig themselves a bigger hole.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's the route I would go also. I think sometimes people maybe well-intentioned, maybe not, but ask questions that they don't realize they're asking until there's a cue to them, right? Like asking, could you tell me why, that's important information for you to know for my candidacy. It will send them in sort of one direction or the other. Sometimes it is their cue. Okay, oh, I apologize. You're right. Of course, there's all different kinds of reactions that people can have to that. We're going to talk a little bit in just a few minutes later on in the presentation. Also, we're going to go through some sample kind of responses because we had a feeling that might be a question like, okay, so if they ask, what do I do? So we'll go through some scenarios too that I think will be helpful.
Yeah. And to the question that popped up, I do think, why are you asking that, is a good multi-purpose response, but obviously it depends on the situation. Alrighty, let's go to the next slide. So yeah, we touched on this a little bit, but what does that mean to discriminate? It means disparate treatment. So intentionally making decisions such as refusing to hire somebody based on a protected characteristic. You can see in here we have a Black woman who's wearing a headscarf. So you could make assumptions about this person's race or their religion, and if she's being treated differently than somebody who, say, looks like this other person in the wheelchair, that's a problem. But in disparate treatment is in some ways easier to think about and easier to point out, but there's also disparate impact discrimination, which is much more subtle. And there have been major court cases about this that have sort of evolved over time. And what disparate impact is where you have policies or processes that will have an adverse impact on individuals with a protected characteristic. One of the cases that springs to mind was a company that required literacy tests of their employees, and I believe they were in the South, and the literacy tests were very, they tended to weed out Black applicants because of the segregation of schools, the fact that the Black applicants were not given as good of an education or as weren't given equal opportunities to get an education as white applicants. And this was for a manual labor position that required very little, if any, literacy. So that's the sort of thing where employers are going to get in trouble if you've got some sort of hoop that you're making employees jump through that affects different people differently based on a protected characteristic. Random example, if you required something on a Saturday, and Saturday is the Jewish Sabbath, and Jewish people couldn't apply because you had this one thing just on Saturday. That opens you up to disparate impact kind of discrimination. So I think it's implied in most of this presentation, but I think it's really good to bring out in the open. You are not required to share that information in the application process. And I mean, my general life advice to you would be to not share more information than you need to. Like, don't give somebody the excuse to discriminate against you based on a protected characteristic. Because if they do it when you're hired, that's equally problematic. You have just the same standing to go to the Division of Human Rights or whoever to complain about it. I would, if something is going to change whether you apply for the job or not, I think it's okay for you to ask. If something's going to change whether you accept the job or not, it's okay for you to ask. If it's not going to change whether you apply or accept, or it's something that needs to be accommodated, I would practically wait until you get an acceptance of the job, or you're thinking about whether to accept it in order to bring it up. I would not disclose more information than I need to prior to the offer phase.
When I talk about, something like salary negotiation is, let them decide that they want to hire you based on the criteria that they're supposed to be using. And then, it's once you have an offer, right, this sort of formalized, you are who we want to hire, then you can bring in some of those things if, for example, they are going to be, you know, important things in your employment relationship, then you would want to bring them up. So it's similar to talking about salary in that, you know, let's decide that I'm the right fit before we bring in all of these other components. Okay. I don't see any other hands, so we'll move forward. So really when we're talking about these protections, you know, I liked kind of putting it in this simplified version, at least for myself, in thinking about, you know, this criteria that we're talking about, these protected characteristics, they're not supposed to be using it in any shape or form, right? If we're talking about someone who's in a wheelchair or someone who is not, if we're talking about someone with straight hair or someone with curly hair, right? It's not supposed to be a factor. It doesn't matter if, you know, you're considered to be in a majority group, minority group. It is truly just not supposed to be a consideration.
Right. Just bringing up some other federal protections that apply in addition to Title VII. The Americans with Disabilities Act protects you if you've got a disability that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And what that means is, this sort of ties into Eden's question, right? If your employer needs a physical to determine whether you can do a job, they can only require that after they've made an offer to you. You can't require a physical prior to that offer stage. You're also required to provide reasonable accommodation and an interactive process to individuals with disabilities. So what that basically means is, once you've gotten the offer, if you say, hey, I have this disability, I'm concerned about this aspect of my job, the employer has to determine, first of all, whether that aspect is an essential function of your job. And secondly, whether there's a workaround that would allow you to perform that essential function of your job. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, basically what that means is you can't use genetic information in making employment decisions. And that includes genetic testing of an individual, that includes asking about family medical history. So if anybody brings up anything about your family medical history, you do not have to answer that, and they should not be asking. Immigration Reform and Control Act, you cannot discriminate in employment decisions based on citizenship. Again, after the offer and the acceptance of that offer, what they can do and what they must do, in fact, is verify that you're authorized to work. But that does not come into play prior to you being an employee.
Okay, so in thinking about what some of this means, wanted to sort of break it down into the three, you know, what I would consider to be some of the main points as takeaways during this application stage. So as we were talking about, with disclosing any of, you know, a protected characteristic that you identify with, that there is no need during the application stage to identify with any of the characteristics. So that might mean a resume, a cover letter, right? Inevitably, there's some personal information that goes on those documents. But if, for example, you know, and I talk to a lot of students about, should I put this particular student organization that might tell, you know, that might cue someone that I am part of a protected characteristic. That is, you know, something that inevitably I think is a personal choice. There are ways, and of course the Career Services Office can talk with you about some of the fine tuning about ways to communicate a similar thing if you don't want to say specifically, for example, what the student org is. And so we see it in resumes and cover letters for sure, that you have the choice of whether you want to be really, really specific or whether you're going to take out some of the details so that you don't give them the opportunity to discriminate. As we've been talking about, again, with these characteristics, they can't ask. And so the one exception to that I definitely wanted to address, because we do get questions about this, is if any of you have filled out a job or internship application online, sometimes you'll see this questionnaire associated with it. It'll say, what is your race? How old are you? All of these sorts of things, right? And you're like, this is interesting that they're asking me, because from your perspective, it does seem connected to your application. Employers are required to keep that information separate from your resume and cover letter, your candidacy for the job. They're doing reporting about how diverse their candidate pools are to governing bodies that they report to. And so that's their purpose. It is voluntary that you fill out that information though. And so it's supposed to be separate, right? And not considered in your candidacy whatsoever. But I have talked with people who feel better to not fill it out, right? And that's going to be your choice. Eden, do you have a question? The hand is up and I just want to make sure.
Oh no, I'm sorry, I forgot to put it down.
Okay, no problem at all.
Thanks.
Okay, so as we're talking about these characteristics, and we're trying to be preventative, right, in disclosing information, having knowledge about things that they should or should not ask as part of this. In general, what we have here is, we'll talk more in detail about these bodies a little bit later. But in general, just to note here that there are different enforcement bodies that exist depending on what the protected characteristic is. And so as we're talking about, that graph of federal characteristics, most of those do fall into one place with the EEOC. And then there's going to be other bodies depending on what the characteristic is. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that also. What these bodies in general help people do are report discrimination claims. They do investigate charges. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. They can recommend remedies, and in some cases, they're mediating disputes between the person and the employer.
And so when you're interviewing, it's the same characteristics that are protected. Title VII still applies, ADA still applies, GINA still applies. And this is where the interview stage seems to be where people really run into trouble. Whether because they haven't been trained, or they're just not thinking, or you get in conversation about somebody and start asking things like, well, do you have children? So illegal interview questions are obviously really hard to handle, because you in that situation as the interviewee are not the person with power. You're the person who's there trying to impress the person on the other side of the table, who is now putting you in a very difficult position. And the first thing to know is just, which questions can they not ask me? I will tell you, I have answered illegal questions in interviews because I just wanted to impress the person and didn't want to say, well, you're not supposed to ask me that, right? You just sit there, you smile, and you tell them what they want to hear. Legally, you do not have to do that, and you are entirely within your rights to put on the brakes there. So, citizenship or national origin. They can't ask, are you a US citizen? Because that's not a criteria on which they get to make hiring decisions. They can ask, are you eligible to work in the United States? Which is a very broad question that they're going to sort of drill down into later when they've got to do your I-9 and determine that you are, in fact, eligible to work in the States. What country are your parents from? Again, national origin discrimination. Or where were you born? What is your background? So what is your background could be professional, right? And if you get that question, I would tend to say, well, this is my professional background. And then again, they're either going to back off the illegal question or they're going to double down on the illegal question. And hopefully they do the former, but if they do the latter, may tell you something about whether you want to work for them. It's totally fine to volunteer the information of where you're from, right? I mean, we do tell you to not disclose more things than you need to and not give them a way to make illegal decisions. But if it's relevant to say, I mean, often that kind of thing will come up if, say, I've had a lot of people ask me, well, how did you wind up in Ithaca? Like, are you from the area? Which that's not a national origin discrimination question per se, because it could be regional. And in my case, I say, you know, I grew up in the Philly suburbs. I came to Cornell for law school. I really liked the area and wanted to stick around. I have disclosed no discriminating information there. Whereas if you are from another country, your answer to that question would disclose like information that they're not allowed to use in making decisions. So I would just say that's a judgment call based on your comfort level. However, I think it's good for you to understand that they can't ask the question, right, of what country are you from or where were you born, right? The national origin discrimination piece is not something they're allowed to do. What they can ask, again, is can you show proof of citizenship, visa, alien registration status if we decide to hire you? They're probably not going to ask that, but that's something that they're allowed to ask broadly. They just can't say, oh, you're here on a visa, so we're not going to hire you. Can you speak, read, or write English? Oh, good question. Are companies allowed to not hire people if they can't sponsor international working visas?
And I think that question is worded really, really carefully and strategically with the employers that ask that as part of their application process.
Yes. So if you're legally eligible to work in the US and you say yes, and then if you say, will you now or in the future require visa sponsorship for employment? If you say yes to that, then they get to ask further questions.
Yeah, I think one exception that that we see with students is the H-1B after graduation, right? Because that gives them 1 year to be able to gain experience in the United States, in which, you know, true as the definition of sponsorship truly is that the employer is not sponsoring, right? And they're really thinking of, you know, am I going to need to spend money to do the, you know, the work to get this person a visa? So the exception is, you know, students that are graduating who might be seniors, or for internships during the summer, is that the employer really is not needing to spend money to, you know, what I would say how they're defining sponsor. And so it's, you know, it's honestly a gray area. I think it's one of the areas that is the most maybe I'll say misunderstood. I'm not sure if that's fully what I mean. It's one of the areas that I honestly think that the regulations are a little bit vague, and I think employers can, of course, operate within the vague spectrum of how much they ask.
So they have to ask everybody, are you legally authorized, and do you now or will you in the future require sponsorship for employment visa status? So they have to ask everybody who they ask the first question, the second question as well. That has been the USCIS, the EEOC guidance to employers on asking about visa issues. Yeah, so disabilities, this is a really tricky one. And I have found that people with disabilities generally do best when they know the framework going in, and seem to get better with practice at different jobs. They can't ask, do you have any disabilities? Or have you ever suffered a workplace injury, right? Have you ever suffered a workplace injury is going to open you up to claims that you're discriminating against people because of their prior use of things like workers' comp. What you can do, and what you should do, and what they should do, and the direction you may want to point them if they ask one of the incorrect questions, is describe the job and then ask you if you can perform all the functions of that job. So for jobs that require lifting, often as part of the interview process, somebody will sit down with you and say, hey, we need somebody who can lift 30 pounds over their head regularly. Is that something that you're capable of doing? And then you just answer whether you're capable or not. And if there's a disability that prevents you from doing that, you can go into potential reasonable accommodation discussions. So financial questions that they can or can't ask. So this goes back to largely adverse impact analysis is the basis for these questions. Asking whether you own a car, right? Whether you own a car is not relevant to your ability to perform your job. I had a colleague at the firm where I worked who his family had one car and his wife took it to work, and he had to frequently go to court in towns that were 2 hours away. So he got through that via Ithaca car share and borrowing other people's cars, which was absolutely fine. And he was not, there's no adverse employment action that can be taken against somebody for lack of car ownership. But you can ask, do you have reliable transportation, right? Are you able to get to work on time every day? You can't ask, again, do you live close to here? Doesn't matter. You can live 3 hours away as long as you can get to work on time. If they ask you anything about your race or your color, they're not allowed to do that. It is never a bona fide occupational qualification to ask about race or color. And yeah, you can answer the question or not answer the question, but you can also, that is a real easy way to go straight to the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission or the Division of Human Rights or whichever local agency you want to go to say, hello, this employer asked me a question about my race, and they are not allowed to do that. Sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, they really should not be asking you about that. There is an exception to Title VII called bona fide occupational qualifications. I don't think there has been any bona fide occupational qualifications finding in favor of an employer who was trying to claim it for like probably 40 years. So the one big case about this involved a prison in Alabama that was extremely violent and all male, and the prison claimed that it was not safe to hire female employees to work there. Subsequent employers making a similar argument were not as successful as this one prison in Alabama in the 70s. So just throwing out there that the bona fide occupational qualification is a legal concept that exists, but employers are very unlikely to prevail on that basis at this point in history.
Okay. I put some other questions on here, which are, sort of food for thought, and we won't be able to go through and practice these right now. But these are others I've heard, right? So in terms of potential preparations for yourself, even in thinking about how you would respond to some of these questions. Asking about, oh, your name is interesting. Where are you from? Is English your first language, right? What they need to know is maybe that you can speak, read, write, right? Whatever the requirements are for that job. First language is not something they need to know. What year did you graduate college, high school, right? That's associated with age. How do you identify, which is such a general question. Sometimes these really, really open-ended questions are the ones where they might feel like they've given people enough wiggle room to respond how they choose, and where you can ask clarifying questions. So how do you identify what makes you a diverse candidate falls into that same pool? To think about, okay, what do they want? What are they asking me right now? And so we're actually going to go through and practice that one. If there are no other questions at this point, I know we're getting a little bit short on time, but this one, what makes you a diverse candidate, is one that I've been hearing pop up lately. And so we thought it may be helpful to practice that one a little bit. And so, of course, you have choices to make here. You can, like we've been talking about, identify as, however you choose within, this question. For example, what makes you a diverse candidate? But there's also going to be other ways to respond, again, if you're not wanting to disclose those characteristics. So Emily, if someone were to ask you, what makes you a diverse candidate, how do you think you would respond?
What makes me a diverse candidate? So I'm coming to a general counsel position with a strong background in, among other things, family court litigation, which gives me a unique perspective on conflict resolution, right? You see how drawn out conflict can be, and you get to, with that perspective, help your client foresee problems and avoid them.
Yeah, and so that's a focus on experiences, right? Which is something that they already know on your resume, and you're still answering the question, right? Unique background based on prior experiences is certainly a way to answer that question. Another way, that I think I might talk about also is in personality. I may be a little bit different from your other candidates because, with my work in the nonprofit sector before I entered career services, I, lead people and interact with people with more compassion, because I've, been in those jobs or whatever it might be, or that I really value other people and getting other people's thoughts about things. And I think that that's going to aid me well in this position because this, and this. So experiences, personality, right? There's a lot of stuff you can talk about and that they'll be interested in the interview that don't necessarily disclose some of those protected characteristics.
You also want to be mindful in answering these questions. Some of the best advice I got from a career services person was, tell them about the skills and knowledge that you bring to the position and how you can help them. You always want to spin your answers to, this is the aspect of my personality that's going to benefit this company for this reason. And that is also a really good way to get out of, questions where somebody's getting at a characteristic that they're not allowed to ask about. You just sort of deflect and say, look at this other thing that is part of, what I bring to the table that's going to benefit this company for this reason.
Wanted to make sure that we also shared resources, right? Because we're talking about trying to prevent some of these situations when at all possible, and, really talking about education, and didn't want to also avoid, what if this happens? What do I do, right? If I feel really like something has happened to me in some way, what kind of action can I take? So I did some screenshots of these websites. This one is for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So as we were talking about, you know, that kind of longer list of protected characteristics is where the EEOC will fall, at least in some cases. And so this is a spot, right? All of these we're going to be talking about filing this one's charge of discrimination. Some of them are called complaint, but basically providing them with information about what happened. So that's one. Second, for disability related cases and complaints, the U.S. Department of Justice, again, this screenshot here, by mail, online, right? Different ways to be able to do that. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is the legislation, the law that exists. It's linked to, of course, the ada.gov website, but it is the U.S. Department of Justice. And then for citizenship, you know, some of those things with international status, it's called the USCIS, but U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Again, they're calling it a discrimination claim, but that's going to be the website to be able to do that. A local resource to share is the Tompkins County Workers Center. You can see this really quick list of things on their website. They have a hotline and an email address for any local things as well, to just be able to even have a sounding board for, you know, hey, this happened and I'm not sure where to go or what to do.
Yeah, and I would say for the federal complaints, go straight to the EEOC for the vast majority of them. It's very rare that you're going to want to go to a different agency than the EEOC, and they will, a lot of times, even if you file a complaint with the New York State Division of Human Rights, they will, they share information with the EEOC and vice versa. So your Division of Human Rights complaint can also be an EEOC complaint at the same time. And most states have a Division of Human Rights of some kind. They may call it different things, but if you look up, you know, your state and employment discrimination, you'll probably find the particular agency to which you can complain.